where we have key discussions rotating around key issues affecting the country. And of course, our kind of discussion today will be rotating around organizations and of course, especially within the public sector or the government entities. But of course, as you will definitely know that such an issue like procurement is wide and huge, but we'll definitely try to tackle it in one way or the other to at least address a few issues here and there. Before we get into our conversations this morning, remember to grow your investments with the Zabu platform. Zabu is a platform that is powered by Altex East Africa, and that reminds you to always do something new. All you need to do is to quickly kickstart off your investment journey with Zabu by using the USSD code *292#. And of course, after using the USSD code with *292#, you'll be able to invest in government bonds and other securities in the next 24 hours, because then you will be eligible to kickstart off your investment journey. Zabu is a platform that is powered by Altex East Africa, and it says do something new. The markets on this particular platform open up at 8:15 a.m. and closing time at 3:15 p.m. East African Standard Time. You should as well note that these markets are fully closed during the weekends and on public holidays. Zabu, my money, my future. Altex East Africa, do something new. Well, you can choose to invest in government bonds with just a minimum of 50,000 Ugandan shillings. Well, joining me this particular morning to discuss the issues to do with unmasking procurement envelopes in organizations, I do have a senior procurement specialist, and that is from the Procurement Worldwide Uganda Limited. That is from Procurement Worldwide Uganda Limited, and that is none other than Herbert Mulumba, joining us this particular morning to get into context with our discussion about procurement. Good morning, Herbert.
Morning, Sako.
Good to have you here this morning.
Yeah, thank you for the invite. Invigorated, and procurement is a subject that I always want to talk about.
All right. And speaking of which, in Uganda, the public sector procurement accounts for a significant of 60% of the government spending, excluding the wages, and of which 30% of the nation's gross domestic product is also in there. So it is by far the largest share of GDP that is under direct control of the government of Uganda. So when we talk deeper in understanding procurement, we definitely dive into our conversations this morning now. But when you look at the situation, can you provide an overview of the procurement process in organizations in Uganda?
Well, you could say that looking at the private and also the public sector, the procurement cycle encompasses all includes the process of obtaining goods and services, contracting, through purchasing, leasing, and different other forms or methods of procurement that they need. So it's a whole bigger cycle from the planning, bidding, contracting, payment, and now until disposal. So it's a bigger process that is undertaken by all the public and disposal entities in Uganda, and post-primary, that means secondary schools and also universities, also under the public procurement. But the private sector also is the same. It's the same process, though different procedures, but the principles are the same. They remain fairness, competition, and all those other principles remain the same. But procurement is a very big subject to discuss. Like I told you, we can look at a couple of things. And like you said, the unmasking the envelopes, we'll be looking at a couple integrity risks that involved in every point of the whole procurement cycle.
Okay. And how common are procurement envelopes in organizations in Uganda, by your observation?
Yeah, you see, these integrity risks occur at every stage of the process. For example, at the needs assessment, because like an entity or an organization, they need to assess the needs they need to have. So at that stage, people can overestimate or underestimate what they need. So that also will impose a risk. And then when they move on to the other stages, like bidding and contracting and all those stages, all of them have a different integrity risk that they pose. And focusing on one stage will affect the other.
Well, I think that brings me to, first of all, understanding. I would have even asked, what are these stages of procurement? Briefly, just take us through these stages. The main stages of procurement, the procurement process until the final project.
Oh, thank you very much. But I think to make it easy for the viewers out there,
yes,
the procurement process starts with the needs assessment. For example, the entity or the organization, they sit and determine what we need for this year. What does HR need? What does marketing need? What does finance need? So they make a procurement plan as a first stage. Then that procurement plan is consolidated to make a consolidated procurement work plan that they will follow. It will be like their guidance when they're buying these goods and services. So from the procurement process, planning, they go to contracting or bidding. They send out bids and solicit for proposals. Then they do an evaluation. And then after the evaluation, they select the best bid according to the quality and the price that they need. Then they issue a purchase order or a contract. Then goods are delivered. There's goods receiving. Then from all that, there's payments. Then after payments, there's a whole inventory management process that goes on. Then there's also disposal at the end of it all. So that's the whole comprehensive procurement cycle.
Okay. Yes, so I think when we look at, let's now get back to the overlaps here in organizations. What do you think are the main factors contributing to such overlaps, and which overlaps are mainly found during, the procurement process in the country?
Thank you very much. For example, the public procurement is purely guided by the Public Procurement and Disposal Act of 2003 that was revised in 2014. It has been receiving many revisions, even 2019, now up to this day. So it's the guiding factor. But for example, a typical government procurement process takes over 90 days from the beginning to when the goods are received.
Okay.
So that length itself alone is a long period that many things will happen within those dates. So the lapses occur at the different stages. For example, poor planning by entities. You talk about the weak laws, like I've talked about the Act. The Act, it's outdated in so many ways because the world has moved on. There's e-procurement, there are systems, ERPs that can be used, and there's what they call value for money. The value of the shilling today is different from the value of a shilling after 90 days. So if your process takes 90 days, then there's a lapse. You lose value for money. But you see, because of the weak laws and the outdated laws, the procurement is not well guided in a way that the law does not, it's not in sync with the current realities.
Oh, okay.
For example, in the private sector, if you need to procure anything, it will take me 2-3 days. I do a procurement plan, I do a quick sourcing, and I'll select the best available bidder, and I'll issue them a procurement order or a local purchase order or a contract, and they'll deliver the goods in 2 days. Whereas for the government, it takes a longer time. It takes 90 days because they have to do a procurement plan approved by the PPDA, approved by the accounting officer. Then they go through a bidding, which takes another 21 days. Then there's evaluation, which takes another longer time.
Yes.
By the time the 90 days end, in the private sector, they have already procured. So the lengthy periods also pose a risk. The laws that are in place also cause a risk because they're not well, covering. But for example, let me give you an example. The doctors have a Uganda Medical Association that takes the doctors.
Yeah.
The lawyers have a law society, that governs them. To one point, if one lawyer misbehaves, they withdraw the license.
Okay.
Now, if you can give me an example of one procurement officer or procurement in both private and public that maybe has squandered funds or has mismanaged an office, that they have ever withdrawn a certificate or a practicing certificate from them. There was a professional procurement body before. I don't know if it's still there. I was a member of it prior, but now I don't think I'm an active member there. Though I'm registered with the CIPS and all these other international bodies. But there's an IPPU, it's the Institute of Procurement Professionals of Uganda, which is supposed to be enacted by the law of an act of parliament. The government has not done that. But if they did that, then the procurement officers would be liable that if I commit this, maybe there's a punishment for it.
Okay.
So absence of all those things leaves the whole cycle, the whole procurement sector at risk.
Well, when you look at the Ugandan perspective here, the government, for example. What are those potential consequences of procurement overlaps in terms of, one, financial implications, and then also the overall efficiency within organizations? This can actually be even in the private sector. Where are those consequences, underlying, long-term consequences that we're likely to face in case we do not address these overlaps in the procurement proceedings?
Thank you, Sonko. For example, there's what we call value for money. Is buying something that is worth the money. For example, if we're to procure a road for 10 years, but because of the lapses that exist, there's corruption, there's kickbacks and handouts that are handed out to the people that are involved in the whole procurement process, we find that we might get a road for 2 years instead of a road that would have lasted for 5 years. Yes. So that's value for money lost in there. There's an issue of risk of health, because there is a compromise on quality
of the kind of health facilities provided.
Exactly. If someone is procuring medicine, they would get a kickback and they'll buy the wrong quality, and that will affect our health. There's sustainability, environment protection. The many other consequences that will come out because of these lapses. For example, most of the procurement in Uganda is actually donor funded or based on foreign debt. You find that we are forever indebted. We have to pay back all this money, and the value that we've gotten from the procurement versus what we have to pay back, there's lost value for money. So you have to look at all those consequences that coming up.
Let's look at now the policies or measures in place to identify procurement envelopes. Do you think organizations, from the private sector perspective, do you think organizations are doing enough to address these issues quite often when they happen?
Yes.
Or what delays government to address such issues? Or which measures should we have
in place?
In place.
Yeah, thank you. To address that, there have been many interventions that the government has tried to do. For example, they have tried to review the Procurement Act, the PPD Act, has been reviewed on several occasions to include other things like health and environment and safety and other global, accepted best practices. They've tried to do that. They've tried to review and make new bidding documents which are friendly and all that. They have tried to introduce an e-procurement system. There's EGP system that was introduced by the government to automate the procurement process such that there's an audit trail. Okay. They have also introduced a contracts management system that will help them manage. But ultimately, there are two things that need to be done. Number one, improve the law such that it's more tougher but also flexible in a way that it shortens the procurement process. Number two, fully automate the procurement process, because with an e-system it's easy to track and trail. There's an audit trail. Who signed this, who authorized this, who removed this, who paid this. Now you separate the procurement process from the payment process. You introduce a purely payment process like the government has already done. There's what we call IFMIS, which is run by the Ministry of Finance, whereby the money doesn't go through the entities. If an entity is buying, all they have to do is to trigger the procurement process, but the payments are already done by the Ministry of Finance, just
to foster the transparency issue.
Exactly. Such that not the entity buying, the entity paying.
Okay.
You buy, but someone else is paying. So through that IFMIS or a payment system, the Ministry of Finance is able to monitor the votes that they have distributed to the different, and they pay directly to the vendor. So the vendors have to register with the Ministry of Finance, and then their payments come directly to them. They don't have to go through an entity, because the moment they go through the entity, there's a kickback from the process of, for me to give you a contract, you give me back maybe 5 million. For me to pay you, you give me, for me to receive the product, you have to give me a kickback. So those are some of the measures that need to be put in place. Number one, I'd forgotten, is also as procurement professionals, they need to be enacted into a body. Like I gave an example of
law and
of doctors, of lawyers, such that they're accountable right
to that
now.
Particular body.
Yes. If you do any anything outside your there's a punishment for you. That way they would have it in their mind that, if I do such a thing, maybe I might lose my job, I might lose my practicing license. Okay. Because like you said, procurement accounts for almost between 50 to 60% of government spend, or any organization spend. So most of the money actually goes into procurement.
Okay, and of course, when we look at transparency, we've been mentioning transparency.
Yes.
What role does transparency, play in reducing these procurement overlaps? Because when you look at the public procurement procedures, for example, the reason as to why the Ministry of Finance is actually trying to create this issue of transparency is because of the accountability that the Ugandans want.
Yes.
Because they are paying their taxes, so they want to see how their money is being spent. But what is this role of transparency, and how important does it, so what hindrance does it solve in such scenarios of procurement overlaps?
You see, transparency is one of the key principles of procurement. It's actually, if not number one, could be number two, transparency. Okay. And of course, the government has tried over the years. They used to have what they call tender boards or tender notice board, that's where every tender that is supposed to be passed out is advertised, and they put it on the tender notice board. Now, even PPDA, the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Assets Authority, they have a website where they display bids and tenders to encourage everyone to participate. So that way they are trying to do transparency. But the best way to do transparency is to introduce an e-system whereby all the procurement tenders are in one place, and they advertise according to the number of days they are meant to be there, and then people can also bid through the system in an e-portal, and the bids are opened within the system, because that will avoid manipulation. If in a paper-based, people change tenders. You bring one tender because they see who has the bigger, they remove them and extract them. These are things that are happening out there in the world. So to increase transparency, introduce an EGP, which is a e-government procurement portal, which already exists, and they have tried out with different entities. A few, I think the Capital City Authority, there's Ministry of Finance, and a few entities that they have picked here and there to do a pilot of a system. But that will increase this transparency, because without that, then with the paper-based, we cannot be sure of what is happening. And of course, even the payments need to be on the IFMIS, or they can use a payment system, a payment gateway, that payments are transparent. If the vendor bidded for 90 million, we want to see the vendor receiving 90 million in their account, not a vendor bidding for 100 million. But at the end of the day, they are paid almost half to execute the particular, because the rest of the money finds its way in other places. So transparency is very key, and to improve it, you have to go through all those processes.
Okay.
Make the law clear, introduce a new system, and
Wait, but when you look at the sectors or industries in Uganda, do we have specifics that are more prone to procurement overlaps, in your observation? And, because we quite have a number of sectors in the country that are driving the economy.
Yes.
But do we have specifics or the major sectors where you look at and you know that it is highly expected to have procurement overlaps unless otherwise, or if not well managed?
Yeah, thank you. One of the key and most maybe ignored is actually the local governments.
Okay.
Local governments as a sector in itself, there's an act that, a procurement act that governs local governments, but most of the things that happen in local governments, municipalities and all these others, those are very vulnerable areas, because they're not in the limelight. They're not really seen much on television or on radio. So that's one of them. We have then post-primary secondary schools that are spread across the region. They're also under the Procurement Act, but there's so much risk going on. And then of course we come to the bigger sectors that we expect that have a bigger chunk of the budget. For example, the roads. The roads has been for the longest time one of the most vulnerable sector. Then followed by what would I call it? The public service, NSSF, and all these other things that are followed. There's defense, which has classified budgets that not everyone can access. So we don't know what happens in between there. So that's a very key sector. The other would be education.
Okay.
Because it's spread wild.
Does this also apply to the private sector?
And the health. Health is the biggest.
Okay.
Private sector, very much. You see, but private sector is structured in a different way. First of all, the processes are shorter, and every coin counts in the private sector. So every money counts, and every single shilling counts in the private sector. So the only vulnerability is in the sourcing, and with dealing with suppliers and that sourcing process, where you're trying to find a supplier and maybe trying to get a kickback between that. That's where the vulnerability is. Otherwise, in the private sector, the payment part of it is really strict. Yeah, so the only integrity risks will occur in the private sector around the sourcing, while trying to get a vendor and all these other things that that would happen in between there.
Okay, but how can the organizations in Uganda enhance their procurement, or rather to minimize, if you're to look at it, to minimize these overlaps or even eliminate them? Because do we have any strategies or plans that are well tested of and can immediately work and eliminate these overlaps that often happen in overtime?
Number one, you have to take adopt best practices elsewhere. Look at different countries and what they're doing, and you adopt some of the best practices that are available. But like I said, number one, we need to enforce or look for a procurement professional body, like the IPPU should be empowered and enacted as an act of parliament of parliament. It becomes a law. But when you're a procurement officer, you belong to a professional body, you get a professional license. You're a certified public or private procurement officer or manager, whatever. So that body will govern you, and then it will be like for your ethics and code of conduct. Number two is to go E. Okay. Automate the process. It increases efficiency and transparency. For example, in an e-system, you can see who did what. There's an audit trail, and then it's quick and fast, because now we have these new technologies, AI, artificial intelligence, that can help you. The payment gateways where we can pay vendors quickly, where you can source. There are actually trade websites like Alibaba, Amazon, and all these others that have changed the whole space for procurement. So professional body, e-process. The other is internally, the organizations and the country at large should have a strict procurement policy, a procedure that can bite. Okay. Yeah, a policy where you say when you go wrong this, it bites you, because some policies are silent. They say, okay, when you're to buy, maybe you send out a bid, do this, and they're not biting policies, but there's what we call a biting procedure, a biting policy that can tie your hands, and once you do something wrong, it really has a repercussion on it. Okay. So those are some of the key things that need to be put in place to improve.
Well, indeed, our conversations will definitely return after the break. We're still rotating around and asking the procurement overlaps in various organizations, including the private sector and the public sector at large. Well, of course, I'm still with Herbert Mulumba, and obviously, as we're heading into the break, remember to kickstart off your investments and grow your investments with the Zabo platform. *292# is the USSD code that you need to use to kickstart off your investment. And in the next 24 hours, you'll be able to invest after you are done registering with your national identification number. You should note that these markets are fully closed during the weekends and over the public holidays. But if you are able to invest from Monday to Friday, you will be able to do so from 8:15 a.m. to 3:15 p.m. East African Standard Time. Zabo, my money, my future, and Alltex East Africa reminds you to do something new. Well, when we do return after the break, we look at the recommendations, the way forward, and of course, more conversations rotating around procurement overlaps in various organizations. This is the Business Insight, and you're watching Smart Means Business. Good morning.